Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum. More specifically, we're going to discuss the Ether Bitcoin valuation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. It is Black Friday, so if you want to enter in a code 2023 into the checkout, you'll also get an extra 10% off on your first month. Decision time is soon, in my opinion, for the Ether Bitcoin ratio. I think that within the next few weeks, it could be as early as next week, but I think within the next few weeks, we should have a major decision on which way the Ether Bitcoin ratio is going to break. Okay, now, if you're unfamiliar with my views on the Ether Bitcoin valuation, I like to be as transparent and honest as I can be so that you can kind of understand where I'm coming from, learn from, where I was right about things, where I was wrong about things, and hopefully come up with your own decision on how to navigate the market and how to hedge yourself based on what your prevailing opinion is. So, my view on Ether Bitcoin, really it started in 2019. I was quite bullish on it. Some of the first videos on my channel are about are about that. We were expecting this pretty large breakout to the upside in early 2021, and the last video in 2020 on my channel was called like Ethereum. Ethereum, remember the end of December, and the idea was that you go into Ethuary, right, or Ethuary, whatever you want to call it, when Ethereum tends to outperform Bitcoin, and that of course occurred. Now, where I sort of floundered a little bit is I did not turn bearish on Ether Bitcoin here at 0.088, right? So I did not turn bearish on it there. But once we got this rally back up, and it was very apparent where the overall market was heading. This was right around the times that a lot of these bigger platforms were starting to collapse. I became bearish on Ether Bitcoin right here at around 0.075, right? And I actually, at the time, I converted a lot of my Ethereum to Bitcoin. And the reason why I converted it to Bitcoin and not to US dollars was because by converting it to Bitcoin, it still gives you exposure to the potential upside while minimizing your downside risk, right? And I didn't know how low Bitcoin was going to go, so that's where I converted a lot of Ether into Bitcoin by, in anticipation of Ethereum Bitcoin bleeding off and on for the next couple of years after that. And in the short term, I was right. I mean, I felt great because we saw this thing collapse all the way down. And where I think I went wrong on this was I did not anticipate, the extent of the rally going into the merge. Once it became apparent that this was rallying back up, I still said it's likely just going to come in and be a secondary distribution phase, just like Bitcoin had in 2021 and form a lower high, unlike Bitcoin, but it did form a lower high. But ever since then, again, I've sort of reiterated lower highs and lower lows, right? Lower highs and lower lows, not a popular theory, but it hasn't been wrong, right? Like this theory has been correct. Some of the theories that I talk about have been incorrect. It's just important to sort of hold ourselves accountable and remember that. But this one has been correct. Now, one of the difficult things about this is that while it has been correct, all it takes is a single week for the market to completely change, right? And for this entire thing to be completely wiped out. Okay. But I think decision time is almost upon us. It could be as early as next week. But trying to predict exactly when things are going to happen is incredibly difficult, right? It's so hard. There's no way I can possibly know. But just looking at some of these weekly candles, this pattern is following very closely so far. You come down in here into the this range at around 0.05 or so. You get two green candles and then a red. Same thing over here, two greens and then a red. And then the fourth one over here was green with a long wick up. So far, the fourth one is green. We've had a wick up. The wick hasn't gone as high, though, as the one we saw over here. The one we saw over here had a wick, basically back up to where these other wicks were. So if it were to go back up to where these other wicks were, it would imply Ether Bitcoin going back up to like 0.057 or 0.058. And still, if it did that, it would still be within the realm of what we saw back over here. Now, if you know, or if you look at this, you'll see that 2 greens, a red, and a green, and then that 5th candle, that was the decision candle, right? That was where the market decided where this thing was going to go, for the next year or so, right? I mean, and again, we've made it back down to these levels, but that is, this was the decision candle. Like once we had this move up, everyone just sort of flooded back into Ethereum from Bitcoin, and the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation went all the way back up, close to the highs from this cycle, but still did not quite take it out. So my base view for a long time, and I just want to sort of reiterate it for people who maybe haven't watched me before. My base view, that could be wrong, right? My base view has been that Ethereum's Bitcoin valuation is ultimately heading to about 0.03 to 0.04 eventually, right? Eventually. And that from that level, it can potentially start to go back into an uptrend against Bitcoin. Now, again, not a popular view, but there's no denying that it's been in a downtrend, at least since the merge. At least since the merge, this thing has been in a downtrend. This move here, I anticipated, right? We said that this is likely going to drop down, even though technically it's a descending wedge, and a lot of descending wedges actually break up to the upside. But, I said basically that it's more likely to break to the downside because this is where the Bitcoin dominance goes higher, and a lot of the altcoin market just basically systematically bleeds back to Bitcoin. So why is the next few weeks such a decision time for Ethereum against Bitcoin? Oftentimes, Ethereum, there's this seasonality that can come for Ethereum, but it doesn't tend to occur until like mid-December or early January, where it'll often gain some ground against Bitcoin. So we're still a few weeks away from that. So my argument is that we're within a window of weakness for the Ether Bitcoin pair that could last for the next, let's call it 3 to 5 weeks, right? A window of weakness. And that doesn't mean that like it can't climb back up to 057 or 058 or even higher, right? I mean, if you look at the bull market support band, that's all the way up at 059, almost 06. So it's certainly possible that it could climb back up to those levels. And I'm not trying to suggest that it can't, right? It certainly could. But the window of weakness, I think, will be over the next few weeks. Like if it's going to break down, then I would assume it's going to do so sometime in the next few weeks. If you look at seasonality with Ether Bitcoin, there does tend to often be some type of favorable outcome for Ethereum once you get into Q1. That doesn't always happen. Seasonality is one of those tricky things where like it sometimes plays out. Like it plays out maybe like 70% of the time. But if you talk about seasonality constantly, then there's going to be like 30% of the time where it doesn't play out. And then, people might be upset about that. But seasonality does not tell you what's going to happen. It tells you what's the most likely outcome, but it does not tell you what's going to happen. Fortunately, going into 2023, I was bearish on the Ether Bitcoin pair. And so, I was not expecting a major break to the upside. And that view was correct. But you can see that in a lot of Decembers, here's an example where Ether Bitcoin capitulated into the end of the year. And then, once we got into January, the move began. This was 2020, right? This was 2020. And I mean, if you look at 2022, we even had a brief move back up to the upside. If you go back and look at 2019, Ether Bitcoin had a nice move here starting about the beginning of the year. If you look at 2018, you can see the Ether Bitcoin bled. Let's just zoom in to really figure out how long it bled for. Let's see. So here's December of 2017. And then you can see starting the week of December 11th is when Ethereum started to show strength. And then in 2018, it was the week of December 17th when Ethereum started to show strength against Bitcoin, right? And again, like it wasn't sustained. We can see that it only lasted for a few weeks, but at least you got a few weeks of some green against Bitcoin, right? If you go further back, right, you'll see that there was a pretty large breakout here in January of 2017 and also in January of 2016 as well. And let me switch this to a log scale so we can see kind of exactly when these larger moves started to occur. This one bottomed out over here the last week of December, and then this one bottomed out over here the week of December 21st. So you can see that there's a window of weakness on the Ethereum Bitcoin pair really from now through approximately the end of the year. But it could, I mean, as we've seen it, there's times where it bottoms out before the end of the year, before getting some type of a bounce. So, my argument right now is that if it's going to break down, which honestly is still my base case scenario, right? If it's going to break down, I think it'll do so in the next few weeks. Because if it does, then you could still get that favorable seasonality for Ethereum in January against Bitcoin, right? Like, so you can imagine a scenario where it breaks down, but then you get into December or January, and then it basically moves back up to these levels, right? So you could get some type of move like that. Now, how could that type of move occur? Well, of course, two different ways, right? One way is if Bitcoin breaks up, right? So if the valuation of Bitcoin were to continue to break up, right? If it continues to rally, let's say into the spot ETF or whatever the narrative might be, but if it does continue to rally and Ethereum can't keep pace with it, which is basically what's been going on for the entire year, then that's one way that Ether Bitcoin could break down, right? So you could have a scenario where Ether Bitcoin breaks off of its support level, and Ether USD is not necessarily showing that same weakness if the reason Ether Bitcoin is breaking down is because Bitcoin USD is going up, right? So there's a scenario like that could play out where Bitcoin breaks up, Ether can't keep pace, and therefore Ether Bitcoin goes down. There's another scenario where Bitcoin goes down and then Ethereum just goes down more and the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation goes down. But my argument is that if it's going to break down, it'll probably do it within the next few weeks. Now, if you're looking at this, you're probably saying, well, so far this has been following the trend pretty closely, right? Like 2 greens, a red, and a green, 2 greens, a red, and a green. Why can't it continue to follow it and break back up to the upside? It could, right? I feel like I'm always learning about these markets, and they humble you the longer that you're in them. It could break up to the upside. And I'm not suggesting that it can't. I just think, again, throughout this entire year, I've reiterated the same thing of lower highs and lower lows. And at this point, that has not changed, right? We have not seen that trend break yet. And, I don't know when that trend is going to break, but my suspicion, if last cycle is an indication, is that it would be once we get back to looser monetary policy. But again, we'll have to wait and see about that. So decision time, I think, is almost here. This week, I don't really think is that important. You could wick all the way up to 0.058, 0.059. You could just kind of hang around 0.054, 0.055. I don't really think it's going to be a huge deal this week, but I think it starts to become more of a thing next week. Because next week, the start of the week is November 27th. So by the end of that week, we're going to be in December, right? We're going to be in the early part of December, which is where that area of weakness is on the Ether Bitcoin pair. A lot of times Bitcoin dominance is often going up in December because Bitcoin's making somewhat of a volatile move, whether it be up or down. So that is sort of a view on Ether Bitcoin. And one of the things about this too, I like to look at the monthly time frame as well. And let me just get rid of everything and show you a couple of different things. So one of which is if you look at the Heiken Ashi candles, you will see, in fact, that every candle this year has been red. Now, not every month the Ether Bitcoin pair has gone down, right? We know that. But every Heiken Ashi candle, which captures these sort of these price movements in a different way, it sort of characterizes them a little bit differently. We have whole videos on how the Heiken Ashi candles are actually calculated. But because they're better at tuning out the noise, it shows you what the overall trend is. And right now you're getting large candle bodies with undershadows but no overshadows, signifying a fairly strong trend, right? So far, every candle, Heiken Ashi candle this year for Ether Bitcoin has been red. I think the next one will probably be red too. And then perhaps next year you might get something like this where you get a little bit of renewed strength, right? So you could get something like that that plays out where, you know, there's some type of reprieve for the Ether Bitcoin pair sometime in early 2024. But right now the trend has been very much intact. You know, it's been slowly trending down. It's been trending down slow enough to sort of make people constantly say that it's holding up well, right? And I'm not suggesting it's not holding up better than last cycle. It is. But at the same time, you know, as an investor, to be honest with yourself, right, you know, you don't look at quarterly returns for an asset and see that it's legitimately been negative every quarter this year and be, you know, and then be proud about that, right? Like that's been a fairly significant drop for Ether Bitcoin. And since the merge, it's down about 36%, 35%. I mean, that's a substantial drop. I mean, to give you an idea of what that would mean to people who might prefer to think about it in terms of conversions, right? This is the Bitcoin Ether valuation, not Ether Bitcoin, so it's the inverse. So like back at the merge, one Bitcoin would have fetched you just under 12 ETH. Today, one Bitcoin gets you 18 ETH, right? So, I mean, you know, imagine if you had converted your ETH to Bitcoin on the week of the merge. Let's say you converted 12 Ether to one Bitcoin back then at the merge. Now, here today, that one Bitcoin that you would have achieved, that you would have gained, now gets you 18 ETH. So what that would mean essentially is that you could then convert that back to Ethereum if you wanted to, or you could convert, say, the difference, which would be 6, right, between 18 and 12. And that's just, you know, it's essentially free Ether, right? I mean, like you took the trade around the merge when all the hype was, you know, all the flipping, narratives and all that stuff. And then you've essentially just printed 6 Ether because you went to the relative safety of Bitcoin. You said, I don't know where Bitcoin's going to go. And after that, FTX collapsed, Bitcoin went down, now Bitcoin went back up. But what you did know is that you believed in the future of crypto and that, you know, sort of sticking with the king Bitcoin through the hard times is probably going to be a better play than sticking with Ether. And it's been the better play. And, you know, when you look at this chart, the Bitcoin Ether valuation, it just keeps on putting in higher highs and higher lows, right? I mean, this pattern is continuing. And you can see that it's coming up to resistance here, right? Like this is the level that it's trying to break through. And before it breaks through, it might have to come back down here, right? It's possible that it has to drop back down, which if it does, it would mean Ether Bitcoin going back up, you know, to the bull market support band and getting rejected again. The other thing that is interesting with the Ether Bitcoin pair is the 20-month moving average. This is something I really like to look at because it really does kind of show you the cyclical behavior of this asset, right? You know, it goes up and then down and then up, and then I think we're in sort of the down phase. But also you could argue that it's sort of in an uptrend, right? The moving average at least is in an uptrend. You know, you do have higher highs. You also have you have higher lows. But you also have lower highs, and we don't really know exactly how that's going to resolve. But let's suppose that it breaks back down here into the 0.03 to 0.04 range. That is where I would start to get more interested in the Ether Bitcoin pair, right? Like if I could see it back down there, I would get a lot more interested in Ethereum with respect to Bitcoin, and maybe at that point I would stop, you know, going on and on about Bitcoin dominance and say, all right, you know, Ethereum is sufficiently undervalued with respect to Bitcoin to sort of justify a larger percentage of it in a portfolio rather than just having a crypto portfolio that is Bitcoin heavy. I want to be clear about the altcoin market in general. I know I've been very critical of it with respect to Bitcoin for a long time. As you get into the halving year, as you get into a theoretical Fed pivot at some point, altcoins should start to durably outperform Bitcoin. It is not clear to me if we've actually reached that stage just yet. I mean, it's always possible, right? But last cycle, we didn't even get that switch until we started to get rate cuts. And so I think that we probably need rate cuts to be a little bit more confident about that sort of view. But this is the thing to look at. And if you look at the 20-month moving average, one of the things that we noted last cycle was that we were trying to break out of it. And if once we break out of it, it's a fairly bullish sign. After we broke out of it, we then came back and back tested that 20-month moving average. You can see that in the prior cycle, we held the 20-month moving average as support before getting the final bounce. Look how similar the chart is. I mean, look at it like this. You have A, okay? So this is your this A is that wick. That's your cycle top, right? I mean, again, the Bitcoin bull run did not end in June of 2017, but the bull run for Ether Bitcoin ended in June of 2017 because it actually hasn't ever even taken out a higher. It's never taken out that high, in fact. And then if you go back down here, this is sort of the B area. This is sort of going to note it with the letter B and say this is where it went back down to the 20-month moving average and held it as support. And in both cases, you got to fake out below it. And then you go back up and you put in a lower high. Right? You put in a lower high. You can see the lower high here, and then you can see the lower high. This was the merge rally where it got a lower high. Right? So pretty clear pattern so far. And I mean, you could even go further back and say that this one, you know, I don't know what you would want to call it, but let's just call it sort of the starting point. Let's just say 0. That sort of is reflective of holding that 20-month moving average as support just before the rally begins, right? So you got your major move up to A, your pullback to B, the 20-month moving average, a dead cat bounce to C where it puts in a lower high, and then here you get another bounce off the 20-month moving average. We'll call that D, which is exactly what we got right here as well. So you have D, and then that is D right there. And then you get your final top just before it rolls over, right? So basically you get the E right there. And that marks sort of that last hurrah before it fell below the 20-month moving average. And now you can kind of see that it's, you know, after falling below the 20-month and getting a monthly close below it, confirming it the following month, last cycle, once that happened, if we go find the date range here, once that happened, it took 24 months to break back above it. 24 months. So far, if you look where it is today, it's already been about 10 months. So it's been about 10 months. So 24 months would put you coincidentally in January of 2025. It's really funny how the cycle tends to repeat itself quite closely, right? So that would put you in January of 2025, which, by the way, January 2021 is exactly when Ether Bitcoin was holding the 20-month SMA as support and starting another, you know, a fresh rally back up to this A level. So I think that we're in this phase, right? I think we're in that phase where Ether Bitcoin is just sort of slowly bleeding down, and it's really difficult to know where it's going to ultimately end. It's hard to know how long it's going to take. You can see that once we came back down to this wick here, right? So I mean, it's so familiar, right? It's almost the exact same thing. So like, look at that wick as 1. That's the same thing as this level, right? This 1 right here is this. Well, I guess it's just the B. I don't even need to redo this. It's just the B on the chart, and then you draw the line across at that wick. So this is where we are, right? We're in this level right here. Arguably, this is where we are. So I think decision time will come soon. And I suspect it could come by the end of the year, like sometime in the next few weeks, possibly. If you look at the chart this way, it suggests that it could take longer, right? It could certainly take longer. Like, you know, what happens if we just get comfortable down in these levels and we don't actually see a major drop again until, you know, half a year from now? Something like that could happen as well. So we probably should be prepared for anything. But decision time should be coming up, right? This is my view, is decision time should be coming up relatively soon. If it doesn't come up relatively soon, then I would speculate that it's just because we're just kind of grinding in these valuations down here, and we're not making a convincing move in either direction, right? But that's where we ultimately stand is trying to figure out is will it eventually break down or not? And when it broke down over here from the wick, it wasn't like that much lower, right? I mean, from the wick, it was another 30% drop. So from this wick, just for reference, a 30% drop puts you at between 0.03 and 0.04, right? That's where it would ultimately put the Ether Bitcoin pair, is between 0.03 to 0.04, which is probably the valuation that I think it would more convincingly turn things around. I do hope that we don't go into sort of a period like this where you spend the next half year going nowhere, because that would, again, it would be very difficult for the both bulls and the bears of the valuation, because we'll just be sort of arguing for another half year, which could certainly happen, right? It could certainly happen. I think some of the main counterpoints, is that the time between C and the breakdown point over here was about 17 months. And if you go from C to where we are today, we're already at 14 months. Sort of suggesting that we might not need like 6 or 7 months of this, right? We've already seen this trend down for about, actually it's even, yeah, about 14 months. But maybe even you could argue 15 months if you take this candle right here, right? It's like, so if you take the last green candle before the trend really started to shift, you could argue it's been, been 1 extra month. But that's where we currently are on Ether Bitcoin. The 20-month moving average is at 0.066. So I have to think that an invalidation criteria would have to be related to, if Ether Bitcoin goes above 0.066, then perhaps the trend is invalidated on a monthly close, not a wick, right? The wicks don't count on an actual monthly close. So I would be looking at that. Let me go back to some of these moving averages. So here's like the 50-month moving average. And interestingly enough, you can see that it sort of topped out at the same level that it did last cycle. It didn't even quite make it to that same level, but it got relatively close. But it looks like it's starting to trend down here. It looks like it's starting to trend down. Once the Ether Bitcoin pair convincingly breaks this and holds it as support, then I think you can make the argument that the trend is starting to change, right? But it doesn't really look like we're at that phase just yet. We could just be, right here, where it's sort of made this drop, but it hasn't really, convincingly broken through that 50-week moving average. And again, that's all the way up at 0.06475. So that'd be a fairly substantial move. The other thing is, if you look at yearly candles on the Ether Bitcoin pair, we've sort of noted this before as well, is that this candle from 2019 actually closed below the wick from 2018. And, again, I pointed this out at the beginning of the year when we were way up here. And now, and this was back at 0.07, and now it's not that far from the wick, right? So it wouldn't take that much more to get this thing below the wick. I mean, it would have to just go down below 0.049. And the way, again, that it could do that, a couple of ways, right? One way is if Bitcoin were to go up, right? If Bitcoin were to get a substantial rally to the upside from here. I mean, Bitcoin's already had a substantial rally, right? So it has had a substantial rally already. But if Bitcoin breaks into the 40K level, right? If Bitcoin were to break into the 40K zone, then that would be an area, I think, that you could still see the Ether Bitcoin valuation sort of fall in. So that's where we are on Ether Bitcoin. And, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, because if it does go to 03 to 04, I'll definitely flip my view. If it doesn't, then I think it's going to take it, if it can get above the 50-week SMA, hold it as support, then I would probably flip my view. By the way, if you guys, if anyone sort of did what I did and converted Ether to Bitcoin right here, and you're watching it over here and you've made like 30%, right? I mean, this is down a lot. Down about 25% or so. So if you've had if that's been a successful trade for you and you want to hedge, you can always hedge, right? Like you could always hedge your bet and get some of your Ether back just in case it doesn't fall to 0304. Again, that's my view, but my view could be wrong, right? I mean, markets are notorious for, doing things that we don't expect. It's not financial advice. I just want people to understand that, it's worthwhile to hedge yourself in these markets, to look at what is the most likely outcome, but how can you hedge against that most likely outcome? Sort of suggest like, well, what could possibly happen to make it so that it doesn't play out like that? I mean, you can imagine that Ether Bitcoin bleeds because there's like some type of spot Bitcoin ETF, and then perhaps there's like some spot ETF for Ethereum in early, in Q1 of next year, right? Or maybe the spot ETF gets rejected for Ethereum, and that's the reason it goes down. I don't know, but that is what I would be looking at for the Ether Bitcoin pair. I think we're likely sort of akin to somewhere over here, right? Looking to see if it'll take out this wick or not, right? And so it's sort of just bouncing around, right? It's just sort of bouncing around in here, and has not yet given any clear indication of which way it's going to head. By the way, I mean, if it does play out like this, just to give you an idea of what that would look like, just so we're all on the same page. If it plays out like this, then it would do something like that, right? So like, bounce back up, bleed back down, maybe to like 0.049, get another bounce, and then sort of slowly bleed, and then sort of bottom October 2024 between 0.03 to 0.04. If it were to follow this pattern, probably isn't going to follow that pattern, so I wouldn't try to take that one to the bank, but could certainly follow that pattern. Another thing to look at is that the other cryptocurrency that has a fairly large market cap, not as large as Ethereum's, but relatively large, is BNB. And BNB, the BNB Bitcoin valuation recently broke down to levels it hasn't seen since April of 2021. And if you go look at Ethereum's Bitcoin valuation, to get to an area that it hasn't been since April of 2021, we'd have to take out, 0.049, right? So the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation would have to drop back down below 0.049, somewhere in that level, for it to sort of play out the same way that the BNB Bitcoin valuation is. And that's where I essentially stand. I mean, and again, like if you're looking at these charts and thinking that has to mean something specific for Ether USD, that's not necessarily true. Again, if Bitcoin goes up, it can drag the market with it, right? Like you can always see an example where Ether Bitcoin goes down and Ether USD goes up. You can also get an example where Ether Bitcoin goes down and Ether USD also goes down. If you look at the last several months, right? If you look at the last several months and you overlay Ether USD onto this chart, you can see that Ether USD has been going up at the same time that Ether Bitcoin has been going down. So you could always have a scenario where if Bitcoin breaks above 40K and it drags Ethereum up to like 2,200 or 2,300, that could still happen, but Ether Bitcoin could drop. And if Bitcoin drops, and of course Ether USD would also likely drop. So I think that's where we stand on Ethereum, or at least that's my view. There are a lot of people that disagree with my view on Ether Bitcoin, and it's probably worthwhile to go listen to what their views are, because you certainly don't want to live in an echo chamber and only get one opinion. So I would suggest that you go look at other opinions on the Ether Bitcoin pair to get an idea of what are some other potential outcomes. There are some people that sort of look at these other trend lines like this, where, suggesting it could come back down to 0.04 and then bounce. You might ignore that wick there and just sort of connect the dots here, right? I guess if you connect it from like here to here to here, you can see that's kind of right where around, I mean, if you sort of fudge the line, right, you can try to make it line up like this, but that's sort of where it is as well. So there's a lot of different ways you can look at the Ether Bitcoin pair and sort of draw different conclusions. I've explained why I think it's more likely to eventually break down than up, but I also think, hedging your bets in case it doesn't is not always the worst outcome or the worst strategy. Just to make sure that if it does break up, you're not left, trying to, YOLO in as it's going back up, only to then buy it at potentially another lower high. I mean, think about how many people converted Bitcoin to Ether here at the merge because it was going to lead to the flippening, and then ever since then, Ether Bitcoin dropped 25-30%. So I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Remember to check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. And again, you can use the code 2023 to get an extra 10% off on your first month at checkout. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.